You're listening to the Vocabit podcast, where I help students improve their vocabulary for the SAT, ACT, and life itself using my unique and research-backed story-based method. On this podcast, I'm sharing the best tips and tricks for a more enriched vocabulary and pain-free test day. Hello, and welcome to episode 56 of the Vocabit podcast. I'm Erica Abbott, a former English and history teacher, the author of the young adult novel Ahead of Her Time, and the founder of the eponymously named vocabulary company, Vocabit. I'm loving this writing mini-series. If you're following along and writing a book of your own, you're probably into the actual drafting at this point. You are writing the actual words of the story. And this can be an intimidating time because it's one thing to have an outline, but it's another thing entirely to stare down 300-odd blank pages. I want to share with you my trick to writing individual scenes, and it's the same thing that I do for short stories. I call it the popcorn method, and I definitely didn't invent that name. It's been around for a while, but it's what I personally find to be the easiest. You start with a kernel, an observation, a quote, a line, and you use that as your jumping off point. When I was in maybe middle school or high school, I already loved writing, and my grandma told me that successful authors always write down interesting observations, and I've been doing it ever since. So now I have a 12-page Google Doc just filled with these little kernels that I use to turn into stories or scenes or whatever. I've used some of these kernels for Vocabit stories, and I thought you might be interested to hear what the original kernel was, because you've also maybe heard the final story. This was the kernel for the time-traveling teacher story from episode 20. Time travel has been invented, but is heavily regulated and only open to authors, filmmakers doing period pieces, and some historians. Our protagonist somehow ends up at their convention. Feels like a business conference, but off. Someone's like, "What are you here for? Character research? Period piece?" She's so confused. Someone replies, "Forgive me, would you like a flyer?" End quote. So you can see that the final story changed quite a bit. In the final version, she wasn't confused and just randomly at this conference. She planned her life so that she could go. When kernels turn into popcorn, they kind of take on a life of their own, but that original kernel, not to get too into the metaphor, is still there. Here's that original kernel for the Boudicea Story from episode 10. Like a mad scientist, but with history. Modern Boudicea describing her dad. That's it. The kernels don't have to be quite as long and fleshed out as that first one. A lot of mine are just random quotes that I thought of or read or heard or something that someone said that I thought was funny. Another one of my kernels just says coastal avocado, and a huge scene in the sequel to Ahead of Her Time is potentially going to spring forth from that. I've already kind of thought of it, I just haven't written it yet. Because only a certain type of person, to me at least, would describe something as coastal avocado instead of green. Someone who describes something as coastal avocado probably works as a designer or in fashion. And then, okay, what kind of life do they have? How do they treat their assistants? And then what happens if a certain person, wink wink, goes and works for them? Just those two words can bring so much to life. Little kernels like that are all over the place. And if you want to be a writer, I definitely suggest you start writing them down. I love that I have 12 pages of these, and it's a living document. So it's 12 pages, but I'm often deleting things and adding things. I used to have a physical notebook that I'd write these kernels down in, but I didn't always have it on me, and I found that I would forget things by the end of the day. So now I just write stuff in my phone and transfer it to a Google Doc later. I know it's not as authentic, but I just find it easier to keep organized this way. Ultimately, the lesson here is when filling in the details of your story, I find it easiest to start with a kernel, some interesting observation, quote, idea, phrase, and just build on that rather than starting from nothing. And the sooner you start writing down these kernels, the easier this process will be moving forward. It was really hard not to put a bag of popcorn pun in at the end there. All right, I'll see you guys next week. And if you do have a second to leave this podcast a 5-star review, I would really appreciate it. Thanks again.